Today, I'm joined by medieval historian and pastor's wife, Professor Beth Allison Barr. We dig into women's leadership across church history, the early church's female ministers, and why Beth thinks that biblical manhood might be more cultural than biblical. Stay with us. Hello, and welcome to Premier Unbelievable, the interview. I'm Luke Martin, and I'm your host for today, and I'm thrilled to be with Professor Beth Allison Barr. Beth, how are you doing today?
I'm doing quite well, thank you.
Well, thanks very much for taking the time to join us. Beth, do you want to just introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Sure. So I'm Beth Allison Barr. I am a professor at Baylor University, which is in Waco, Texas. And I'm actually a medieval historian. But what I have become best known for is my writing on women in the church. So my first book, which was The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. And my recently released book, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, How Marriage Replaced Ordination as a Woman's Path to Ministry.
Excellent.
And I should throw out there, I'm a pastor's wife also. So have been for 28 years now, I think.
Very good, very good. My mother is actually a pastor's wife, has been for about 30 years or something. So something in common there. So I look forward to getting into your book soon. Before we get into sort of the message of both of the books, let's just sort of give the viewers and listeners a bit more of a sense of who you are. So do you want to just speak to giving a sense of your upbringing and how you sort of find your way to the faith and the worldview that you hold now?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Texas, in a small town in Texas, and my father was the town doctor. It was a very small town, and my father was the town doctor. And he was also the deacon one of the deacons at the Baptist church where I grew up. I don't remember a time when I didn't know about Jesus. I don't remember a time when I didn't, pretty much I always remember believing in Jesus. I officially gave my life to Christ when I was about 8 years old, when my sister sat and prayed with me. And I was baptized in our small town church. And I always felt like God was calling me to do something. And as I went through college, it became clearer and clearer that he was calling me to do some sort of work with the church, but also through my skills as a writer and as a scholar. And it sort of my life kind of all came together how that was going to work out when I met my husband, who I told me the first day that he met me that he felt called to be a pastor. And at that point in time, I was looking to go to graduate school in history. And I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with it, but I really felt strongly called that my ministry would be through becoming a historian and alongside my husband. And so lo and behold, it actually worked out for us. And we got married and both of us went to graduate school. He went to seminary and I got my PhD in medieval history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And our life sort of unfolded after that.
Excellent. Excellent. And you're now a professor at Baylor University, which is a fantastic university. I know several people who teach there and have done their PhDs there and spoke very highly of it. So what drew you to history? You said you did your PhD in medieval history, and of course there's religious elements there. So what drew you to history?
Yeah. So I was always a reader. My family encouraged reading books from a very early age. And when I was an undergraduate, I actually was a classics minor. And my goal was to go into classical history. But I also felt I was very interested in women and what women were doing. And these were the questions that I had. And I remember very clearly this moment when I realized that if I wanted to get my PhD in classical history and work on women, then either I only looked at the few literary sources that we have available, or I became an archaeologist simply because of the lack of sources. And at the same time, I was taking a course on medieval history. And I read a book on women in the late medieval English countryside. And I was like, whoa, this is fascinating. We actually can learn a lot and know a lot about the ordinary lives of medieval women, including their practice of faith. And so I decided that I'll just move up a few centuries. And that's exactly what I did. And I applied for medieval history, and I've never really looked back.
And
So
you already had the Latin from your classical studies,
yes,
which is
yes, that
good.
worked out well. And
Excellent. I'm
I
getting
also
it.
had, yeah,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I also had German
Okay.
as an undergrad because I was required to do two languages as an
Okay.
undergrad.
Very
So,
good. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit nerdy now. So let's draw us back. So let's think about all your work. So you've published these two books, 2025, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, and then 2021, The
yeah.
Making of Biblical Womanhood. But if you think of your work all together, what would you say is sort of the main message or the main messages you're trying to communicate through your work?
Yeah, I'll throw in, I have an earlier book that nobody knows of because it's my scholarly book, and it's on the pastoral care of women in late medieval England. And so I think the through line, even in my academic work, all the way through becoming the pastor's wife, is a look at what women are actually doing in the church and how attitudes about women's work in the church both helps them as well as limits them, and how women interact with male clergy, as well as within their families. And so that's sort of a through line, I think, throughout of the all of the work that I do is what are women doing in the church? How are they able to decide what they want to do? You know, are they able to do whatever they feel called to do, or are there limits being placed upon them? And if so, where do those limits come from?
Okay, that's really helpful. And that clarifies things for us. So we're talking about sort of gender roles in the church.
Yeah.
Many of our viewers and listeners may be aware of this debate between egalitarians and complementarians. Um, and of course, there's also the issue of gender roles in the family. Am I right
Yeah.
to say that you haven't worked on that issue quite as much?
Well, they're interwoven together. My book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, was about this concept. And, we've mentioned complementarian and egalitarian, and those are very modern terms. Egalitarian is the idea that God doesn't put limits on what women can and cannot do in the church, that they are able to freely serve however they are called. Whereas complementarian argues that God designed women for a particular role that is connected to their role as wife and mother, and that also that they are called to serve differently in the church, which means, and there's a variation on this, but it means that at some point they have to serve under male leadership, whether that be the primary pastor or priest, or whether it be all the way down where they can't even teach Sunday school. But at some point, they have to yield to male leadership. And that concept, though, stems from the understanding of how God created the family.
Hmm.
Did he create it where men and women are called to very distinct roles that are prescribed, and that pretty much have stayed constant throughout history? Or is, that focus on male headship within the family as well as in the church? Or when God created male and female, He created them both equally in the image of God, and that calls women and men to do all sorts of things throughout history, without really limits based on their gender.
Hmm. Lovely. Thank you. That really clarifies then the link between gender roles in the family and gender roles in the church. Now,
Uh-huh.
you've spoken and written, I believe, about sort of the cost of speaking up. So, before we dig deeper into some of these
Yeah.
books, have you ever sort of wondered whether you're about to publish a book? Is it worth doing it? Is there going to be costs, professionally, personally, to me? Is that something that's ever come up for you, Beth?
Absolutely. I tell people that the making of biblical womanhood was not something I ever really set out to do. It was the culmination of my husband losing his job at a church over the issue of women in ministry. He was advocating for a woman to teach Sunday school, and he ended up losing his job over that. And me speaking out mostly through writing in public blogs. I wrote on a Pathos, which
Mm.
some people may be aware of. I wrote on a blog called The Anxious Bench for quite a while, and I began speaking out on that blog about what I knew about history, and especially women in church history. And it gave me the opportunity where I was asked if I would be interested in writing a book. And seriously, my thought was, after I thought about it for months. I mean, I literally thought about it for months. And then I was finally like, well, it can't hurt. I was like, I'll try. That was my thought. I was like, I'll try. But even once I had made that mentally and I was sent a contract, I let that contract sit at the end. I still remember it sitting at the end of our kitchen counter, and it sat there for a good month. Um, because even though I was like, I have a shot, I want to try, I knew that speaking out on women's roles in the church would potentially put me and my family and my husband in the middle of this of a fight that has been going on in evangelical Christianity for about 50 years now, and has gotten quite ugly in some spaces. And part of me was thinking, do I really want to do this? And I remember the moment that I decided to do it. And it was when I was in the kitchen making coffee, and both of my kids came out. It was Saturday morning, and they were kind of bleary eyed, and they were sitting down and they were arguing. And I just suddenly thought, you know what? This isn't about me. This is about the future of the church. I want their future to be better. And so I decided to write it. Um, and the cost has been high.
Just briefly, do you want to give a sense of them? Do you mean
Yeah.
people have, because obviously I'm a teacher myself. I try and teach
Yeah.
my students that when you engage with work, you engage with it charitably. So you try and present your opponent's terms in a way that that they'd be happy with, and then you just try and engage in debate. Do you
Yeah.
mean that you got pushback that wasn't of that sort?
Yes. Yes. I think you can just Google me and see sort of, especially with the making of biblical womanhood. It was, because of what I argued was that this concept of biblical womanhood, that complementarianism, was not rooted in the Bible. This is not God's plan for humanity. And I argued that, in fact, it was actually was simply a cultural construct. I hate to use the word pagan because it's loaded with all sorts of things, but that complementarianism is rooted in cultural values, not biblical values. And that got me significant blowback. And there were some people who engaged with me, just fine, like scholars do. But there was, a significant, the Gospel Coalition in the U.S., Desiring God, John Piper's ministries. These were very unhappy with what I had written,
Mm.
and wrote some really terrible reviews. Like, one of them actually went after me as a mom and accused me of being a bad mother because I talked about Saint Paula, who God called her, and she left her children. She left her children to go fulfill God's calling. I had, the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood actually used my church to try to fundraise by saying, they said something that was untrue about the church that we were in publicly, and sent it out in a fundraising letter.
Mm.
It was really, there were times that I really regretted having written it. In fact, I tell people that in the U.S., we often do things where we show a picture of a U.S. president before they're elected, and then at the end of their term, and
Oh
they show how
yes.
much they've aged. I'm like, people need to do that with me with the Making a Biblical Womanhood, because I have aged considerably, visibly, since writing that book. And part of it is the absolute stress, especially that first 2 years. I say all the time, I don't know if I'm ever going to recover from writing it.
Wow. Wow.
So
I'm sorry to hear that.
it's okay.
Because yeah, I mean, as in my profession, we try and really encourage charitable disagreement. The book did well, though. Is that right? This is the interview on Premier Unbelievable. Make sure you subscribe and leave a review. It really helps others find the show. Join the conversation at any time by emailing unbelievable@premier.org.uk or through your favorite social media platform.
We are launching a brand new course which helps us to consider the evidence and questions around the birth of Jesus. It's called Did It Really Happen? The Birth of Jesus. Why not sign up for the course or gift it to a friend? Find out more at premierunbelievable.com.
Absolutely. Yeah, it sold over 100,000 copies. Was a USA Today bestseller, hit several bestseller lists at the time. It landed me on NPR for Morning Edition for like a 7-minute interview, which is really crazy. It also got me a feature in the New Yorker, which also is crazy. So the amount of publicity that book got is, it's not anything I ever could have tried for. I really do think it was a God thing, that it got the attention that it did.
I was about to ask, yeah,
Yeah,
what the reason for
yeah.
that was in your view. I mean, is it partly that the topic is just it was the right topic, the right book at the right time?
Yes, I think that's part of it. I had one of my, I followed a book in the States, written by a friend of mine, actually, Kristen Kobes-Dumais, who wrote Jesus and John Wayne, and which is another book that some people may be familiar with. And my book, The Making a Biblical Womanhood, followed it by about 8 months. And her book, I think, kind of paved the way for my book a little bit. I also think, and this is part of it too, that I was really the first person to tackle this topic from the perspective of a medievalist. I think my book was different. It wasn't simply sitting down and arguing over what these words actually meant in the Greek. I wasn't simply, in fact, I honestly didn't even want to write about Paul until my husband was the one who convinced me to do a chapter on Paul, because he was like, no one will take you seriously unless you deal with these things. You have to deal with them. And I finally gave in and wrote a chapter on Paul. But honestly, I was trying to get people to step back and look from a different angle at this concept, and I think it worked.
Okay, so
Yeah,
let's dive a bit deeper in there.
sure.
So what you said is you were trying to present the view that biblical womanhood is sort of culturally constructed
Right.
rather than being straight from the Bible or something. So you do want to dig into that
Yeah.
thesis.
Yeah. So my argument is that what complementarian today, which argues that women are called to follow male leadership, I argue that this is, and one of the things that they argue about it, they say this is something that makes Christians distinct from the rest of the world. And I'm like, no. Limiting women and saying that women belong under the leadership of men is not something that makes Christians distinct. It's something that makes us look just like everyone else. And in fact, the patriarchy that we see in Christian households where women are, to submit to the leadership of their husbands, that they're to be, sometimes even not supposed to work outside the home, or if they do work outside the home, it can only be underneath, with the permission of their husbands, et cetera, all of this stuff. I'm like, this looks exactly like what we see in ancient cultures with the way women were treated, and even all the way up through in modern history in non-Christian spaces. I said, there's nothing new about this. What's new is that God created women in the image of God, just like he created men. What's new is that, as Galatians says, that there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, man nor woman in Christ, that we are all one in the body. What's new is Paul's theology of the body, in which he calls us all to work together. And he says the head, the eye is not any more important than the foot, that we are all part of a body. And that leadership, headship, is actually Jesus. And that is who we follow. We follow Christ. Paul says that, follow me as I follow Christ. Not follow your husband who's under this pastor, who's under this pastor, and then finally maybe someday we'll reach Christ at the top of that.
Okay, I'm just thinking, so what might a complementarian say to that? Might a complementarian say, well, what's new or special about the complementarian view is that, yes, wives submit to the husband, but the husband loves the wife as Christ loved the church and laid his life down for them. So could the complementarian say that's what makes it special and unique and impressive as a setup, that this sort of sacrificial love from the husband? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, I would say on the one hand, yes, that is, Paul, I think, is inserting something new into Roman culture ideas about marriage. I mean, I argue that in The Making of Biblical Womanhood, that this is indeed something new that's going on there. But when, Paul says that husbands are to love their wives as Christ loves the church, in a Roman culture in which theoretically and legally, although it didn't always play out this way, husbands had the power of life and death over their wives. And Paul's flipping that on its head. It's saying, no, actually, instead of, you are to love her and lay your life down for her. And this is a radical subversion of that Roman patriarchy. And the whole, Ephesians 5 is prefaced with submit to one another as to the Lord. And so the question is like, what actually, if the husband is loving his wife as Christ loves the church and laying his life down for her, where's there room in that for this type of male leadership that we have inserted, where women are to be in subjection? How does that fit into it? I argue that it doesn't, that Paul is calling for a radical change of the household, and it is returning to the pre-fall state in which men and women are created in the image of God as fully equal and fully human.
Good. So the claim there is that if a wife was to submit to her husband, that would be incompatible with the husband truly loving the wife. Have I got you right?
Yeah, well, in the phrase before, submit to each other as to the Lord.
Right, one-sided submission.
Submit, and then husbands, and then it really pushes it, husbands not only, but you are to love your wives as Christ loves the church, and to lay your life down for her. And so it's a really emphatic call for husbands that you don't do it the same way that we have been taught to do it before. This is something different. And I think, this is one of the things I always do with my students. You're a teacher, I'm a teacher. I always have my students turn to Romans 16. And I'm like, let's just read Romans 16. Just read and tell me all of the women that we see in it. And what we see in Romans 16 is a significant number of women who are called to serve in leadership roles, who are recognized fully by Paul as serving in these types of leadership roles, and that there's not really much attention given to who they're married to. Spouses don't really matter in the early church in that sense. We don't know much about them. What we know is that women are called and serving in the same types of roles as men in the early church. And whether or not they're married, we mostly don't know, because that doesn't seem to be important in the biblical world, which I think is quite significant.
So I don't know my chapters of Romans as well as I should. So 16, is that where you get Junia and
Yes, that's
Priscilla?
exactly right. Yep, that's exactly
Yeah.
right. That's the last chapter. Yeah, it's a good thing. I think I didn't look it up before this. I think it's 10 women who are mentioned in there. It's a really quite significant list. And they're apostle, they're deacon, they're co-workers in Christ. We know that some of those women in those lists they're associated with house churches in the ancient world. And I dove into this a little bit more in my most recent book, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, but all of these visible signs of leadership that we have in the early biblical world, in the first century Roman world, we know so many women who were leading house churches. And, I know today people are like, oh, well, they were hosting it in their home. That means, it's like the pastor's wife, right? That's what you're doing. You're like hosting it. It's like, no, that's actually, they didn't have a church building. The church was in the home. The home was where, they were coming for the church and being directed and being taught. And so this isn't sort of like a make tea kind of and serve the snacks. This is the leadership role in the early church. And we miss that because we have these preconceptions about what the home means and associating the home with women and domesticity and submission.
Yeah, I think these cases of women in the Bible is a real key part of the
Yeah.
debate, Junia, Priscilla, etc. So what do your opponents say to those cases? I know I looked up a book by a chap, Kevin DeYoung,
Oh,
who's a
yes. Yeah.
pastor, and he argues that Junia may have been a man rather than a woman. Or he argues that he has a footnote to an article
Yes.
by somebody else who has argued this. I haven't read the article, but so how would you respond? Yeah,
Yeah.
what are the responses by your opponents to those cases, and how do you respond to them?
First of all, I will say that Kevin DeYoung wrote one of the most uncharitable reviews of The Making of Biblical Womanhood. Anyway, I actually wrote the afterword, the epilogue that I published on the year anniversary of it, and I tell the impact of what Kevin DeYoung's review had on me. So I would encourage, I think it's important that he thought it was okay to write those things. Says a lot about him. I also think that in response, this idea that Junia was a man, this is not something that, so there's a really good book by a guy named Eldon Epp who actually walked through every usage of names in the ancient world. And Junius, which is the name that they claim it could possibly be, is not a name in the ancient world. It's not a name. Junia is a very common name. And so there is that, it's a name that doesn't really have any ancient connotations or any context. It didn't exist. The other problem is that nobody questions Junia as a woman until the Reformation era. Martin Luther's the first one who says something, and everybody pretty much ignores him because they're like, no, there's no textual evidence that it's not Junia until the 19th century. And at the end of the 19th century, when the push for women's suffrage in both the UK and the US is really picking up speed, is when we see the Greek translations, the Greek editions of the New Testament began to change Junia to Junius. And it does not happen until the late 19th century. And it happened all the way up through the 1980s, I think until maybe the 1990s. But now Bibles are now going back and changing it because there's no evidence to have put her as Junius. And even recently, the ESV, I think, I'm trying to remember, I think that's what the ESV recently did too. They admitted, I can't remember if it was Priscilla or if it was Junia. It was one of the two. But nonetheless, but pretty much scholars, that is not an accepted argument, and not just well, there's some evidence here, there's some evidence here. It's a no-go argument, that the name is female. And she's recognized as by the title of apostle. So, I mean, yeah, you can. So Eldon Epp, Beverly Gaventa's also wrote the foreword to Eldon Epp's book, which was really fantastic. But Eldon Epp's book has charts where I love charts. I do everything by spreadsheets, but you can see the charts where he goes through all of the Greek additions all the way back. I mean, he starts in the medieval world, Reformation, and goes all the way forward, and you can see where the change happened. And aside from the one-off Martin Luther, there may have been one other one. And those reasons, the reason they said that it has to be Junius is not because of textual evidence. It's because they said a woman can't be an apostle. So it's one of those arguments where it's not the textual evidence that is causing the change. It is people being like, wait, women can't do that, so therefore the Bible can't say that. So it is evidence of a direct change made to the Bible because of perceptions about what women can and cannot do in the church.
Fascinating. Thank you. And yes, our viewers and listeners can follow up on those leads. So one of the objections from the complementarian camp that I looked at was as follows, and I'll sort of put it forward as in a charitable sense, was that your argument is that this biblical womanhood is culturally constructed. And one of their objections was that your position is culturally constructed in the sense that it's informed by feminist literature. How would you respond to that?
Oh gosh, yeah. So, that's such a fascinating thing to me as a medieval historian, because the argument, this is how the argument goes. The argument goes that until the post World War II, that women mostly were never leaders in the church. In the medieval church, women weren't priests. Women didn't serve in these roles. In the early modern world, we see with many of the reformers, women aren't serving in these roles. And so and women are happy doing what God has called them to do, and sort of these things, until we get to the post-World War II era, World War I and World War II era. And then where so many women had moved into the workplace, we also have emphasis on medical changes. So women have more control over, birth control, for example, is entered into it, and women have more access to education. And all of a sudden, women are like, hey, God, that can't be what the Bible says, because I feel like I should be able to do this. I feel like, so it's like, the argument is that doesn't emerge until the post-World War II era. And I do a lot better of explaining this in both of my books. And so that's helpful, but I kind of just, tried to summarize it very quickly. And so for me, in fact, I can go back to a little bit of my story. Sure. As a medievalist, one of my expectations when I first started working on my dissertation, and I was working on a priest whose name was John Merck, who actually lived out in Shropshire, in a town called Shrewsbury that I'm going to be at on Sunday, hopefully, if the trains are running. But nonetheless, I'll be out there. And I walked into his sermons and his pastoral literature expecting to see women treated as second-class citizens, and women's leadership not recognized, etc. And the very first thing that struck me was that that the Festial sermon copies out there translated the Bible gender inclusively within the sermons. I mean, this was something that really blew. So instead of in places where the scripture, as we might read it, might have the androcentric man, the word man, especially, it would change it to men and women. And that to me was like, whoa, this is interesting.
And
And
what dates are we working with here?
Yeah, this is 15th century.
15th century.
And this is actually, as I said, the pastoral care of women, I have I like chart. As I said, I love charts. I read all 40 extant copies of John Merck's Festial, which were published between, it was published 1383, but it's the early 15th century where we start seeing copies, and they go all the way up until the early 16th century. In fact, John Merck's, this is probably more than you want to know, I'm sorry. But it's the last, it's one of the last medieval Catholic published sermons in the UK. The last publication of it, where it's actually is by Winken de Worde in 1532. And so anyway, so it was a very influential text. And what I found is that that women in that text were treated much more, I hate to use the word egalitarian, but much more equally, in some ways, and that the gendered language, really threw me, this gendered language, taking biblical text and translating it gender inclusively within these sermons. And so I found that narrative I had always been taught disrupted, not by feminism, but by the reality of medieval texts. And that is actually the moment that I began my journey. I was still in a complementarian space at the time. My husband, we were still Southern Baptist at the time. And it had nothing to do with feminism that made me start to move. And I had been exposed to all of the feminist texts. And sort of my thought is that I was like, there has to be a way to reconcile what God calls women to do and anyway, I was still trying to reconcile sort of our modern world, sort of the things about what I thought women should be able to do with still that complementarian idea, which is what a whole lot of women do today. And so what pushed me out of that was the reality of medieval sermons, which I know sounds crazy.
So it's really interesting, really interesting. So,
yeah.
So the claim is that there is evidence of egalitarian beliefs and attitudes in the medieval church, because of course there's going to be the opposite as well. So there's a lot of evidence, overwhelming evidence.
Yeah. So I'll qualify it. I don't like the word egalitarian.
Okay.
It's a very modern word. It's a very modern word, I think, because it means very specific things. In the ancient and the medieval world, legally, in the medieval world especially, legally, women were under the authority of their husbands if they got married. It's called coverture. It's the system of coverture. And that does exist legally. However, as my students learn, women have a whole lot of ways around it, that they get around it all the time, and including legally. And that the medieval church, this idea of the male-only priesthood is not as clear-cut as we think it is. And in my newest book, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, I do a deep dive on this, including using a book by a guy named Gary Macy that's called The Hidden History of Medieval Women's Ordination. And the book is published by Oxford University Press. He is a well-respected scholar. It got really good scholarly reviews. And in it, what he shows is that women served in ordained clerical positions in the early medieval church. And that this is not really, that the evidence is really clear on this. And that it is the central Middle Ages. In fact, it's around the time of when we get between the 11th and the 13th century, when there's a period of what we call the Gregorian reforms that begins to happen, that we see a shift in understanding about what ordination is. And it moves from being, you're called to do this position, whether it be an abbess or a bishop. And by the way, an abbess in the early medieval world had the same authority as a bishop. They were almost equivalent positions. And so instead of you being called to do that particular position, now by the time we get to Fourth Lateran Council, ordination ordains a sacred status. And the argument at that time began that the sacred status could only be put on a male body, because a male body was the perfect body. Women's bodies, according to medieval science, and which is based in Greek, were flawed bodies. But even with this, it is always contested. There's always these very powerful women who serve in these leadership positions throughout the medieval church, and who are recognized as authority figures. We have women preaching all the way throughout. Carolyn Musig is another really good scholar who has worked significantly on female preaching, and women defending their right to preach, all the way throughout. And so this idea that we have of women never being in these leadership roles as constant until we reach, this feminism, and feminism is what changes it, is just wrong. There's just no way to say it. And I think Susan Hyland, who's another really good biblical scholar, I would look her up. She's written a lot on women in the ancient church, including, she has a great book on Phoebe. And what she argues, she says, look, there is patriarchies in the Bible, patriarchies in the biblical world, patriarchy is in church history. There are always people who try to put limits on women, but that's not the only story. There are also always people who support women being able to serve in these roles in the same way as men, and people who do not question women's calling and women serving in these types of leadership roles. And that's also part of the story.
Thank you. Fascinating. I took a course with Carolyn Musig when I was an undergraduate. So
did you?
I know her,
Where? At Bristol?
At
University
Bristol,
of Bristol?
yeah. She was a great woman.
I love her. I had her down at Baylor last year for a lecture series.
Very
And
good.
she has a new book coming out on women preachers in the medieval world.
Excellent. Brilliant. Okay, so it does raise this question. Now, this is a massive question. I'm afraid I'm going to ask for quite a short answer. So just your kind of like just what what you'd say in a few minutes, of how you think Christians should relate to feminism. So your claim is that a lot of these, you don't want to use the term egalitarian, but just for the sake of simplicity, I call it egalitarian ideas, attitudes, practices were present long before feminism. That's your claim.
Yeah.
Then we have feminist literature that has got the first, second, third, fourth waves. I know there's a whole bunch of debate around whether these waves exist and where one wave stops and the other wave starts, etc. But what's your view then in how Christians should engage with, read, think about the literature that came out of these four waves?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing I would encourage people to do is not to be afraid of feminist teaching. For some reason, it's become the F word in the modern church and in evangelical spaces. And I think it's because we're afraid. We're afraid that it's going to, that you cannot believe the Bible. You cannot be faithful to the Bible if you recognize that there is value in feminism, and really, feminism is the teaching that that women and men are fully human. I mean, that's really basic. That they should have the full rights as humans, and that so it's not as disturbing. I mean, there's certainly people who would take it further. and who would make arguments that were fundamentally not Christian. But that's only part of feminism. There's a lot of faithful feminists who are faithful Christians who believe that God created men and women fully human and fully equal, and that we are all called to work for the work towards the good of God's kingdom.
Thank you. And you kept it to a few minutes, which is much appreciated, because we want to get on to your recent book, your 2025 book, Becoming the Pastor's Wife. So I'm going to assume that being a pastor's wife for something like, I think you said 25 years or something, contribute a lot towards that book. So do you want to give us, our viewers and listeners, a sense of the background to that book and your personal story?
Yeah. So after the Making of Biblical Womanhood, my initial thought was not to publish anything else. I was like, I'm just going to go back to being a medieval scholar. It's a lot quieter and that. And after I had a conversation with one of my friends, Scott McKnight. You may know Scott McKnight or know of him, or some of your listeners may know him. And he said, Beth, he said, that's fine. Don't ever let anybody pressure you to publish. But he said, if you have something else to say, you have the platform, you have the ability to say it. And I started thinking really hard about that. And at the same time, I was reading one of my colleagues at Baylor. Her name's Elizabeth Flowers. And she has this great book on Southern Baptist women in the post-World War II era in the U.S. It's a really good book. It's called Into the Pulpit. And in it, she had this section where she was talking about the rise of complementarianism, essentially in the Southern Baptist world in the 1970s. And she emphasized how some of the loudest proponents of complementarianism within the Southern Baptist world were pastors' wives. And that struck me as fascinating. I was like, why? Why is it pastors' wives who are speaking out? And as a pastor's wife myself, I already had an idea of how influential the role of pastor's wife was in teaching complementarian theology and modeling it. I was the model of what women were to do and how women were to act in the church. And so I was like, whoa. Wait, is there a link here between this, what does the pastor's wife have to do with the rise of complementarianism and the disappearance of female ordination within evangelical spaces? And that's where this book was born, Becoming the Pastor's Wife, where I did a deep historical dive on the role of the pastor's wife, where it came from, was it present throughout most of church history, and how it got new life in the 20th century in this fight against women's ordination.
Fascinating. And one thing I just haven't quite figured out is, you were at one stage complementarian. Have I picked that up from what you're saying?
Absolutely.
So when did that change happen?
So I tell a little bit of that in the Making of Biblical Womanhood. It was really, as I said, it was this scholarly side of me who was unable to reconcile what I had been taught in church. And it was a slow evolve, I would say, from the early 2000s. And it was around 2012, 2013 that I was like, I cannot ascribe to this anymore. And I tell the moment that I told my husband that. And that was around 2013, 2014. But we were still in a complementarian space. And sort of my thought was, we can do a lot of good here. People know where I stand, etc. But over the next couple of years, our church became increasingly complementarian, like visibly pushing women out of places that they had been previously in the church, until we hit 2016, which was, the year where everything exploded in the U.S. And my husband and I decided to push back against the elders in the church who had said that a woman couldn't teach high school Sunday school. And we advocated for it. And the end result of that was he was fired.
And the reason, so they didn't want the woman to teach high school because there were men in the high school group?
Yeah, because they said biblically over that in the Jewish world, that a boy becomes a man at the age of 13, between 12 and 13. And so that was the cutoff that women could, and this is something else I never understand in the complementarian world. If women are capable to teach children and other women who are just equally as important and valid, why can't they teach men? Anyway, the logic of that doesn't make sense to me. But that was it. So women in this church could only teach through junior high. That's what we call going up through 8th grade, 7th or 8th grade.
Okay.
So high schoolers in the U.S. context could not be taught by a woman.
Okay. And then my second question from what you just said was, so 2012, 2013 was when the change happened. And was that prompted by study or experience? What got that going?
Years and years. I mean, as I said, this was a slow burn for me, which is why it doesn't bother me that people don't change their mind overnight on this, because I'm like, it took me a long time before I got, it took me over 10 years. And it was a combination of study, my work as a scholar, what I was teaching in my classes, what I was learning more and more, and realizing how incompatible complementarian ideas were with what Scripture actually said, as well as what we also saw in history. And then also with my experience being a pastor's wife and seeing the reality, thinking through, what is the cost of a theology that teaches young boys that there's something innate within them, the way God made them, that makes them able to lead even adult women, and that their voice matters more in teaching the Bible, simply because of their male body. What does that do to young boys who are being taught that? What does that do to young girls who are being taught that no matter what they do, no matter how God has created or called them or gifted them, that simply because of their female body, that they can never serve in their callings or their giftings, because of these artificial limits that aren't consistent, that change from church to church and change from time, and it's like, wait, you say this is all biblical, but everybody does it differently. So it's just my body, something about me is wrong. That's why I can't do this. I mean, the psyche that this has, and I think about in the modern US church right now and the explosion of the sex abuse crisis in evangelical spaces. And I think we're at a place where people can't say it's not the system. We are doing something wrong in the US evangelical church that is teaching men it's okay to use women's bodies. And so, the thought is, where does that come from? And it seems to me that if we teach men, if we teach from the very young age all the way up, that there's something about their bodies that makes them have power over women, then we are teaching them to see women as less. And this is the fruit of what we've been teaching.
Yeah. So I guess the complementarian would respond to that and say, if that's what's been taught, you're only getting one side of the coin there, because sort of what we said earlier was about love, self-sacrificial love of the husband to the wife. So do you think it'd be right to say that it's the complementarian teaching itself which is having this bad effect on the relationship between the sexes, or do you think it would be a sort of an unnuanced presentation of the complementarian teaching, or a one-sided presentation of it?
Yeah. So I'll say where I have come to this on now is something that people don't like. And I really drive it home in the final chapter of Becoming the Pastor's Wife, where I tell a story about a woman named Maria who was a pastor's wife. And, the thing is that I can't remember who said, I think it may be Lucy Peppiatt. I think Lucy Peppiatt's the one who said it, who is a UK theologian, systematic theologian at Westminster. I
Oh,
think
yes,
anyway.
she's
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah. School of
director or
Theology
president
at
there.
West.
Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And she's written some really, and she says, you don't, and I'm trying to remember what her exact quote was on this, but she's like, you don't judge the way you judge a theology, essentially, is you take it to its, you follow it all the way to its potential conclusions. Like, where does it lead? Where does a theology lead? And the problem with complementarianism, I would say, and I can say this being in a complementarian spaces, is most people who ascribe to complementarianism are good people. They are good,
Mhm.
faithful Christians who believe that they are really doing what God has called them to do. And because they love their wives and the wives love their husbands, most complementarian marriages actually function egalitarian. And this is something that research has shown us. Russell Moore wrote an article in 2006 where he complained about this because he was like, we're not actually being complementarian. Our marriages are functioning egalitarian. And that's because you truly love each other and you truly are laying down your lives for each other, because that's what God calls us to do within a marriage, is to put the other one first. And so a good marriage, that's what you do. And so I would say that most people who are in complementarian spaces where things are going well, it's because they are truly loving each other and living out what God calls us to do as Christians. And that, as I said, that a lot of the complementarian parts they add on it really are more lip service to some extent. And that women who are in complementarian spaces who are like, I've never felt limited. I've always been able to do whatever God has called me to do. That's probably because God has never called them to preach. It's probably because God has never called them to be a pastor of a church. And I can say this as somebody who's not advocating for myself. I don't feel called to be a pastor. I
Mhm.
don't feel called to be a preacher. I'm actually very happy as a pastor's wife. I feel like that's my, ministry. So I know that sounds ironic, but so I think it helps me though in being able to make this argument, because I'm not arguing about me. So I would say most churches, most complementarian spaces, it works out okay. But what happens when complementarianism is actually implemented? What happens when the male leader of that house really believes that God has called him to have that full authority and that his wife is to submit to him? How does that play out? And the story, I tell a really hard story that I stumbled across that I did not know was in the archives, about a pastor's wife who lived in a space where this complementarian philosophy played out to its logical extreme. And do we judge a theology by where everyone behaves well, or do we judge it by how easily it goes wrong?
Mm.
And I think I think that's something, as I said, I think we're at a point where people who ascribe to complementarianism, we can't just say these are bad people, these are bad people. There is something we have done in this system
Okay.
that has allowed them to flourish.
So the argument seems to be, because you could say to this, I mean, this sounds like a horrible case. You could say, I assume in this case that the husband wasn't loving his wife as Christ loved the
No,
church.
it's always no.
Right.
No,
Okay. Okay. So it seems to me that your argument is that these two are incompatible. That submission and self-sacrificial agapeic love are incompatible. Um. So so and I guess in other areas of life, say you have, I don't know, a soldier who obeys, submits to his captain, or as an employee, I submit to my employer, or children sort of submit to their parents. Do you think? Because I think the egalitarian needs to then put forward an argument that says that submission and love are okay in these areas, presumably if it's okay for the employee to submit to the employer, but not in the husband and wife one. I
Yeah.
I anticipate you have a response to that.
I'm so glad you let me clarify this. So I think in the Christian life, we actually are called to submit. We are called to always put other people first and to put other people's needs before ours. And in fact, medieval theology, which I read a lot of it is built on this idea of submission to God. I think we are called to submit. I don't see anything theologically wrong with submission. What happens within this complementarian framework? And as I said, this is a brand new thing in church history where it says that simply because you are made a man, that you do not have to submit within, it starts, they say, well, it's only within the marriage thing, but I mean, this spills out into everyday life. Men are taught that they're not the ones who submit, it's the women who submit. And there is no, like, for example, let's think in a child hierarchy, like, children, yes, they have to obey. I have 2 kids. They have to obey. It's to help teach them and to learn. But they grow out of that. There's a way out of that. Let's say you're a soldier on the battlefield. Yes, of course, you're in that job. And it's life and death, whether or not you obey. But there, you can be promoted, you can move up, you can one day become that commander on the field, or you might leave the army and you go out and you don't do those same things. You're not required to do that same thing because you've left that. With complementarianism, it is a permanent thing. There is no way that women can move around this. And, the question, and as I said, in the medieval world, I always say in the medieval world, women were able to get around it. Not all women, it was more challenging, but there were what I call loopholes. I always teach my students there are loopholes. And what we have done is we have taken out all of the loopholes. We say across the board, complement, because this is the way God created us. Women are always to do this role and men are always to do this role. And what is so ironic to me about this is that all you have to do is go back and read Genesis, where, we know the origin of patriarchy. We know the origin of these, and patriarchy is simply systems, cultures that privilege male authority, that privilege male authority over women. And so that's an easy definition for it. And so where do we get this? And it clearly is an effect of the fall, where women are told that their desire will be for their husband and he will rule over them. It doesn't say that God said this was good. In fact, this is the aftermath of the fall. This is not good. It's a product of sin. It's a product of sin. Before the fall, man and women were created in the image of God. And so it seems to me that we're fundamentally trying to make an argument good and true and beautiful that is rooted in the fallen world.
Brilliant. 1 or 2 brief more objections. One thing I love about these long form conversations is that we can really get into the meat, and I think often through hearing sort of the other side, it brings out the fullness of a position. So I guess if the complementarian said that actually to be leader is a burden. It's a burden. You've got the responsibility on you. You've got the stress. So I know you've focused on the ministry aspect, but let's say in the case of the family, you've got the stress of having to decide, where you're going to live, et cetera, provide. And if that goes wrong, it's on you as the leader rather than the rest of the family. So how about that as an objection? That yes, for the complementarians, leadership's on the man, but it should be seen as really a burden that's put on the man rather than on the woman.
Yeah, well, it is a burden. It causes significant stress within families. I just think about this. If complementarianism plays out, it does. It puts undue stress on men. And it's not good. It's not good for either men or women to kind of force them into maybe these roles that they're not equipped or gifted. There's some marriages where men actually are gifted and called in ways that fit the ideal complementarian man, and women are gifted and called in ways that fit the ideal complementarian woman. That happens. But that's not the case for a lot of marriages. In fact, I would say probably most marriages, that there's a lot of struggle in trying to like force these roles. And while certainly it is, the burden of the curse is hardship for both men and women. And that's true. That is absolutely true. But God, I don't think, calls us to live in the curse. That's why he sent Jesus. Jesus frees us. And we are working for the kingdom of God, in which restores humanity, which restores, why are we attempting to live in the fallen world instead of looking for the restored kingdom? And I mean, that's fundamentally, I think, is my response to that.
Thank you. Thank you. The team gave me a question which I thought was brilliant, and it's basically
Sure.
how would you view your legacy, in 20 years time, when you sort of look at the work that you've produced, the speaking, the writing, how would you like it to be remembered? What effects would you like to have brought about in the church or culture as a result of your efforts?
Yeah, so we started off this conversation with me talking about the hard parts of writing, the making of biblical, and even becoming the pastor's wife, and continuing this. But what I didn't talk about is how, for all of the ugliness of responses I received tenfold letters from women all over the world. I still get them. I'm getting them for becoming the pastor's wife, and they're incredible, because it's women who, as I said, one of my favorite ones. I'll give you an example. One of my favorite ones. It came the week of Kevin DeYoung's review of The Making of Biblical Womanhood, which, as I said, just really was a really horrific moment for me. And it was this teacher in China, a Christian. He contacted me through Instagram, through Twitter. I was still on Twitter at that time. He DM'd me, he emailed me, and he wrote the same thing in all of those things. He says, I don't know if you're ever going to see this, but I have a student who really wanted me to get this letter across to you. And he said, she read English. She was in an English speaking, this was a US professor who was over teaching in China. And so he said, but she wanted, he said, I helped her with the letter. And he said, and she wanted it to get to you. And in that letter, she said, I wanted to thank you for the making of biblical womanhood. She said, all of my Christian walk, I always felt like God thought I was less, that God thought that I wasn't as good because I couldn't, because there was something wrong with me, that was her exact word. She said, I always felt like there was something wrong with me. And she said, and then I read your book and I realized that there was never anything wrong with me, that Jesus was always for me and not against me. And she said, and I just want you to know that you gave me back my Jesus. And those words are just really, they carry them in my heart, because what I want women and men to know too, because I think complementarianism, it hurts all of us. I want them to know that God came here, that Jesus came to set us free. He came to set us free from all of these burdens of the sin and the fall, and all of the horrible things that we do to each other. We don't have to be that way. We can live in the full freedom and grace of what is to come. We know what God has for us, the good things that God has for us. And I want women to know that they are called and equally gifted by God, and that God uses them, and that their voices are just as important, and that God sees them as fully human. In the image of God, he made us male and female. And I want women to know that in Jesus they are free.
Thank you. That's powerful. What's next? Or is there a new book on the horizon, or are we taking a break for a while?
Well, I'm writing a third one. When I agreed to write the second one, I said I'll write it if I can write a third one, because I wanted to write a medieval book. And so this one's different. I sort of, Becoming the Pastor's Wife and the Making a Biblical Womanhood are sort of parts 1 and 2. They tell different stories, but they kind of both work towards thinking about, rethinking biblical womanhood and complementarianism. This third book is different. And it is playing to my strengths as a medieval scholar and playing to my love of what medieval women did in the church. And so I'm having a lot of fun writing it. I've been over here doing some research for it. This is my second research trip over here for it. And I'm looking forward to getting it out, and then I'm taking a break.
Excellent. I love research trips. It's a wonderful excuse to go somewhere different and to do some reading. Well, Beth, thank you so much for your time. It's been a very enjoyable conversation for me, and I hope that for our listeners and viewers, as they've heard your view and they've heard some of the other side, that will really help them as they develop their thinking. You've offered a whole several different books that people can look up. Do, of course, have a look at Beth's book, recent one, Becoming the Pastor's Wife. So thank you, Beth, so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I believe you're at Greenbelt in the next couple of days. Is that right?
Yeah, Saturday night. I'm speaking with Sheen McDonald on making and unmaking of women, so in the church.
Excellent. I hope that goes well.
Yeah, thanks.
And to our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Okay, my name's Luke Martin, your host for today, and this is Premier Unbelievable, the interview. Take care. My thanks to Professor Beth Allison Barr. Her books are The Making of Biblical Womanhood and Becoming the Pastor's Wife. Links are in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your friends, and please follow the show on Apple Podcasts or leave a rating or review. For more conversations at the intersection of faith and culture, visit Premier Unbelievable online. I'm Luke Martin. Thanks for listening.